Hey, I'm Brian with NPN. We're back here in the garage studio again with our FX SVHO. We were working on the jet pump. Today we're going to shift our focus over to the intermediate housing and the intermediate drive shaft. That's that forward coupler that's inside the hull, connects the drive coupler on the back of the engine to the drive shaft in the jet pump. Our friends at SBT have sent over a rebuild kit for that intermediate housing. Bearing, seals, C-clips, everything we need to completely rebuild it, make it just like new. So today we're going to show you how to pull that housing out of the hull, any tips and tricks we find along the way, and then we'll take you through step by step how to pull the old seals out, pull the old internals out, and how to press in all of the new parts here in the rebuild kit. Let's get to it.
This season of Project X is brought to you by SBT, the largest supplier of high-quality jet ski parts in the world.
All right, guys, I'm going to tempt fate here with this one. This should be really easy to remove. There's only 3 bolts that hold this intermediate housing into the hull. Obviously, this is the job to do with the engine out. We also have the electrical box out of this thing, the ECM and the other relays and all the electrical components. Those are out, so we have unrestricted access to that intermediate housing. There's 3 12mm bolts that hold the perimeter of the housing into the hull. There may be, depending on your jet ski, there may be a shim or several shims between the housing and the hull. That is to change that angle of the drive coupler based on tolerances in the fiberglass in the hull and the engine and the build overall. If you do find those shims are on your ski, mark them, paint them, bag them, do anything you need to do to make sure you put them back in the exact same location as you pulled them out. You don't want to mix them up. You want them to go back exactly where they were. So let's get right to it. I'm going to climb up here, get some better access. Not really enough room for air tools in here, so I'm going to do these by hand. All right. And there she is. Piece of cake, right? So we've got our makeshift workbench set up here over on the other side of the shop, and we've got the intermediate housing ready to get taken apart. During the jet pump episode, you might remember I talked a lot about improvising tools. This is no different. There's a counterhold tool that's supposed to slide into the backside of the intermediate shaft here, and we don't have that tool. It is very, very difficult to locate. You can find it on some forum posts and some mentions online, but we couldn't find one local, one that we could get our hands on quickly. So, thinking quickly, I took the Driveshaft counterhold tool from our friends at SBT and I cut it down. I made it about 3/8 of an inch across. Here you can see it on the end of the driveshaft. So I have my driveshaft and the counterhold tool clamped into the bench vise, and this is now going to function as my counterhold. I use the driveshaft and the jet pump as my counterhold tool. And there is about 1 inch of spline engagement here. So I'm confident that I've got enough spline engagement that I won't rip anything out here as I'm trying to torque this thing free. Now, the drive coupler itself is threaded onto the intermediate shaft, and that is, the service manual says that it's Loctite 572. It's white thread sealant. This is standard thread. We will turn this counterclockwise to loosen it using that same socket, that adapter from our friends at SBT. Same thing we used on the backside of the engine. Now, the important thing to consider here is there is an oil seal on the top side here that I don't want to melt, so I have to really watch the way the flame is rolling off of this coupler so it doesn't come back and potentially melt that rubber. So let's see. Set that off to the side. Now, of course, everything's going to be nice and hot. Hey! And there we go. Let me tell you, that was a lot more fight than I was expecting to run into on what is effectively step one of this process. A little bit of housekeeping here before we get this set up on the press. There is a flat washer that is behind that threaded coupler that was just stuck with thread sealant. That can be set aside for now, and we have this thrust washer on the back side that is partially hidden by this little rubber seal here. So real carefully pull this guy off of there. And from what I'm reading in the shop manual, it seems like this little thrust washer here is going to come off as soon as I start pressing the shaft out. So I'm going to leave this guy alone. I don't want to bend it, deflect it. I don't have a replacement at the moment. So from here, we have a rubber isolator that goes between the actual bearing, the inner bearing housing and the outer. And that's to dampen some vibrations and keep it from translating up to you. So that rubber isolator, if you go and just try to press this mid-shaft out without supporting this properly, you're going to rip that isolator straight out. So what we need to do is make sure that the bearing housing is going to go like this, and we need to support it from this front face on the inner part of the housing. Just like so. And then we grab a socket to use as an adapter to press down on the mid-shaft. There's one other thing that I almost forgot to say. There is a height measurement from the back side of the outer housing to the top of the intermediate shaft, and that's the depth that it's installed to. Mine is measuring right at 46 millimeters from here to here. My shop manual also confirms that that's what it's supposed to be. It's still worth checking what yours measures at before you start taking anything apart, because obviously it's your one chance to know what yours was set to. There can be some variation from one hull to another. Okay, there, that thrust washer is starting to slide up now. Hand underneath it to catch, just in case. Okay, thrust washer's free, midshaft is also free. There we go. Piece of cake, right? So now, find a way to safely support this thing. There's two seals here on the back side and one on the front. They've got to come out, and we've got two snap rings to release, and then we can press the bearing out. Try something a little more creative. Use the plywood as a block. And use these slip joint pliers to pull the seal up on the end where it's still low. Well, at least bring me up so it's closer to flush, and then maybe the seal puller will finish it off. Just like that. Now, yeah, hey! Now we've got two more on the flip side. But now we can really clearly see there's that snap ring that I was talking about earlier. This is what holds the bearing in place. There's one on the front side here. There's another one hidden behind those two seals on the back side. We will have to get them out before we can press the bearing out. Let's get working on those other seals. Changing up my tactic a bit. I've got it as gently as I can clamped into this vise with a rag to try and protect that aluminum outer surface, using a more appropriately sized seal puller. As I'm trying to pull this seal out, look at the way that that isolator flexes. Oh, hey! I was paying so much attention to the isolator. I didn't even see that starting to come loose. See, sometimes a little bit of patience and a lot of leverage is all you need. Go back to the tried and true plywood method. We'll pull this seal up until it's a bit more flush. There we go. Both of these snap rings, they're right on either side of the bearing, so they've gotten coated in the same grease that the bearing has. If for whatever reason these should be a little sticky, you can take a pick or a punch and a hammer and just tap in one of those holes to get the sides of the snap ring moving. For me, as soon as I grab them with the pliers, I can twist them. I know that they're free. I'm going to squeeze it carefully and pull it out without, without sending her flying. And now, flip the housing over. I can't mount it in the vise again because the shape won't allow me. There we go. All right, with that last snap ring out, now we're ready to set back up on the shop press, push the bearing out, and we can finally rebuild this thing with the rebuild kit that our friends from SBT sent over to us. I just about had everything set up on the shop press, and I very quickly realized that the shop press is not going to work for my application. The plates on the press form a diamond shape, and that diamond shape is smaller than the bore here. So by the time I got the bearing almost all the way out, I would have been bottomed out against the plates and I would have had to reset. So we're going to use a manual tool instead. So there's a few things that we have to consider beforehand. So we have to have what I always refer to as the cup. This is the part of the tool where the bearing is going to be pressed out of the housing and into the tool. So here's our new bearing from SBT. I know that my ID is larger than the bearing, so the bearing will slide in there and won't get stuck. I also have to have a pusher, something to drive that bearing out, and it needs to be just slightly smaller than the bearing. The bearing is about 62 millimeters across. This is 60. So this slides in and out of the housing and won't bind up. So now I need to set up the top and bottom plates here, and it should just be a matter of pushing this guy right out. And then of course the other thing, the reason why I selected one this big, it needs to go on that same front face that we needed to support from on the press. That's where we need to support this thing from too. So this will just very evenly, uniformly push that bearing out of the housing, and at some point we're going to hear the bearing cha-ching its way down into the cup. There we are. So not as effortless as using the shop press, but a whole lot easier than those seals turned out to be. So there's our old bearing. We have number etching, letter etching on the side of it, and that is on the front side. Now that the housing is all disassembled, we're ready to start rebuilding the internals. We have our rebuild kit from our friends at SBT. We've got our 2 C-clips, we've got our 3 oil seals, and our new bearing. There's a few things that we need to be aware of before we start on this. Number one, if you have a shop manual for your craft, I highly recommend keeping it nearby. We're going to be flipping this bearing housing over a number of times, and it's really easy to get out of sequence and forget something really important. Second, there are 3 seals that come in this kit. 2 of them are identical to each other. The third one has this much larger grease lip on it. This is the rearmost seal that goes up against the thrust washer, which is also pressed on the back side of the intermediate shaft. Now, quick run through of what we're going to do. We're going to put in our front C-clip. This is the front part of the housing. This is the part that faces toward the engine. This is the rear. This is what faces toward the jet pump. So I'm always going to refer to this as the front. We'll put in our front snap ring, Pack our bearing full of grease and press it in from the back side of the housing, making sure that the laser etching on the outer race is facing toward the front of the craft, facing down as we press it into the bearing housing. Then we'll flip it back over again and we'll press in the first of those two oil seals, the one without the large grease lip. Then we'll press in the drive shaft and support the bearing from below. We flip over again and we will put in the rear snap ring to lock the bearing in place. Then we'll put in the next identical oil seal, and then we'll put in the one with the large grease lip. And then after that, we'll press our thrust washer, just the thin piece of sheet metal, over the intermediate shaft and up against that grease seal in the rear. So let's get started. Now we're ready, we'll get all lined up and we'll get this new bearing in. From here I'm using a bearing driver that's just slightly smaller than the bearing is, so it can slip into the housing without getting stuck. We'll run our threads down taut, double check that we're centered. Now should be a simple matter of just pressing this right in. Okay, and we're only running this down until it bottoms out, till the bearing bottoms out against that C-clip, that snap ring, sorry. And we can visually confirm, yep, that's what's happened. So now, we flip our housing over and grab our first oil seal here. I'm going to check my trusty manual again. Make sure I'm not getting out of order. Just like with the jet pump, there is no need to grease the outside of this seal. We will put a dab of marine grease on the inner lip before we press the drive shaft in. Intermediate shaft. I keep calling the drive shaft mid shaft. Now we have a depth measurement on this first seal. We need to go, in my application, until it is about 1/4 of an inch below this front face here. It's 6.5 millimeters for you metric folk out there. Now that our front oil seal is locked in place, it's time to push the mid shaft into the bearing housing. A few things we need to be aware of before we start that. Number one, we need to support the inner race of that bearing from below. So I have here for that I have a 44 millimeter bearing driver that sits real nice around the inner race and should keep us from damaging the bearing as we're working here. And we will set bearing housing down on top. So we'll start with a dab of marine grease on the inside of this lip here, and then support it from below with that spacer and start to slide our mid shaft into place. Okay, we got everything tightened up here. We do have a depth measurement that we're gonna have to disassemble all this to check. The bottom of the mid shaft is supposed to protrude out the bottom side of this housing by 46 millimeter. That's just a touch over 1.75 inches. I'm gonna get it to where I think it's close, and then I'll go and double check that depth. So here's what we're looking for. We're looking for 46 millimeters from the back side of the housing up to back side of the mid shaft. And I am at 46. Nailed it. Now, with that done, it's time to put in our other snap ring and our other two, our rear two oil seals. Since I won't have access to it later, I'm going to pre-grease this lip on this inner seal now. So we're going to be pressing this over the midshaft and into the bearing housing. Just like before, tap on it to get it started. There we go. With all this snugged up, we are going to press this oil seal in until it bottoms out up against that snap ring. The next seal, the one with the big lip on it, does have a depth measurement. That right there felt like it was seal bottoming out. Okay. With our outermost seal here, the one with the big grease lip, we'll put just a dab of marine grease on the inner lip and on this outer lip where it's going to mate up against a thrust washer. Perfect. And with this one, just like that last seal on the jet pump, the one that had that really big grease lip on it, we want to use something to drive it in that does not compress on that big lip. We don't want to risk tearing that. This one is supposed to sit just over 1 millimeter recessed inside this bearing housing. So it won't quite sit flush. Just go touch past. Like right there. So we will slide our new thrust washer over the midshaft. Grab something safe to drive it on with. And go right up until it starts to make contact with that big grease lip on that seal. Not going to take a whole lot of force here. Okay. Now those are mated together. We'll put the rubber cover over this thrust washer and check our depth. For that, we should be at or around 4 millimeters, 3.7. That is within spec. Make sure that rubber cover is fully seated on there. Off camera, we cleaned up the threads on the end of our intermediate shaft. We cleaned up the threads inside our aluminum drive coupler. We've got our counter hold tool set up. We can slide intermediate shaft on there. We can slide our new washer on and then apply our new thread sealant onto those threads. And then if I don't drop the tool, it's just a simple matter of threading our drive coupler all the way on and torquing it to spec. Go. That's a wrap for us today. We've got the intermediate housing fully rebuilt and ready to go back into Big Blue. Now we will wait to do this until a later episode when we have our engine the rest of the way reassembled and we're ready to put the entire machine back together. So stay tuned for that step, and we will see you in the next episode of Project X. I'm Brian Sexton, and thanks for watching.